Welcome everybody to session 11 of our classic metal class. We do this monthly, more or less, schedule permitting. And this time we're doing something a bit different. Before we jump into that, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Scott Tarulli, a good friend of mine, fellow metalhead who came up with the music in a different location, but basically in the Midwest, right?
Yeah.
And so we've got a lot of back and forth stuff that we've been talking about over the years, and we decided to start this show so that we could have kind of an excuse to do it. And we explore intersections between philosophy and heavy metal, sometimes doing a bit more music history, but always bringing in some topics from, say, metaphysics or conceptions of identity or cause and effect or ethics. And so it's been a lot of fun. Today we're talking about polling. Scott is a practicing musician. He's played with a number of different artists, bands, done a lot of studio work. He's a guitar professor at Berklee School of Music. He's a band leader. He's got several albums out. So, and he's actually going to be talking too about tech stuff. We are, as we were prepping this, there's a lot of tech stuff that might come in here. And yeah, we've been studying philosophy together for a number of years. Anything else you want to say by way of introduction for yourself, Scott?
Oh, no, that's about it. Just something kind of cool and funny that I came to Greg years ago from seeing his videos. And I sent him an email through his website and said, I'm interested in studying more about rhetoric.
Yeah.
And when we were going through the rhetoric, Greg would always want to bring it to a modern day, how we would use it today. And all of our examples became metal examples. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say we've got the band, Kiss. And, somebody, Paul Stanley treated someone like this. And after a while, it just became our go-to for me to figure out how to use the concepts. And we just had a ball always talking about. And then I think one day you had the idea of saying, hey, we can actually, talk about some of this stuff,
Yeah, I mean, philosophy works best when there's lots of examples. And this ties in, before we jump into today's stuff, a little bit of a digression. So there are some philosophers who think rhetoric is really important. And Scott mentioned, we were studying rhetoric together. We were studying Aristotle because Aristotle thought that, unlike Plato, who is very anti-rhetoric, rhetoric is really important. And rhetoric is being able to adapt yourself to an audience. And you could call it showmanship in a way. If we're thinking about musical stuff, somebody who was really great at it that we are just observing the birthday of is the late great Ronnie James Dio. You watch him engage with anybody in an interview, and it's amazing how he can zoom in, figure out what's on their mind, adapt what he wants to say to them. And so, Aristotle, Cicero, other authors, it turns out that rhetoric is quite important in philosophy. And so, Scott was an audience where we could talk metal. And as it turns out, the two kind of illuminate each other. There's a lot of things where if you know a good bit about metal, you can use that to make sense out of philosophical principles or arguments in very interesting ways. And maybe we'll do some of that today. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure it'll come up. When we talk about the different eras. Some of these bands are career bands. They weren't 3-month bands that had one hit on the radio.
Yeah, they all have pretty massive catalogs. That's for sure. So the topic that we're talking about today is what makes best albums best. And I think this actually came out, Scott, you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong about this. You and I were kicking around the idea of like determining for given bands what's actually their best album. And we were saying, oh, that's really tough to say. The better the band, the harder it is to figure out. Like, it's easy to say, oh, top 5 albums or something like that. But to say this one is the best and to have some, not just like a gut reaction, but to have some sort of reasonable grounds that might be convincing to another person, it's tough to come up with. Is that how we got to talking about this?
Well, we came up with a list of criteria, which we'll be discussing. Well, wait a minute. Like, what do you mean? Like, the album that introduced me to the band, or the one that I heard the night of my prom, or to have sentimental reasons, or was it
Yeah.
what, like you said, what am I judging my decision on?
Yeah.
I think before we go in, and I'll be using this, I was thinking about it. It's kind of like you mentioned kind of is popular mean it's the best. Well, I'll have kids, they'll all know Don't Stop Believing by Journey, but that's because it was on The Sopranos. It was the last, and everybody knew that song suddenly,
Or
and
included in Guitar Hero.
and that's a big one. And then The Stroke by Billy Squier was in some movie, so they all knew it, and it's the only Billy Squier song they knew. But does that mean it's his best, or just because it was part of pop culture, resurged in pop culture?
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's jump in. So we decided in order to make the discussion manageable and to focus a bit, we would talk about 5 major classic metal bands. 3 of them are British. One of them is an American artist. One of them is German. So we picked Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Dio, including Ronnie James Dio, which had some bleed over into Rainbow and Black Sabbath, and then the German band Accept. And what I did is I polled fans in my social media on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. So obviously not a scientific, polling with great accuracy, but I just wanted to get some useful suggestions and input and see where other people were. And I also compiled some stuff from Kerrang and from Louder Sound that kind of dovetailed with that. We might do more episodes like this on other key eras or scenes. So maybe 1970s metal, talking about Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, UFO, and then pick another one, or the LA scene or thrash. But we're going to stick with like what we can call traditional, or, the core of heavy metal for this one. And when we're thinking about this question, as Scott mentioned, it's not a popularity contest. We don't want to say, oh, well, who sold the most albums? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best album. It just means that things aligned in the right way. I mean, a great example of this is look at Metallica post Cliff Burton. I would say that the best stuff is the Cliff Burton era, but they went on to sell way, way more albums afterwards when they sort of like hit on the right registers all at the same time. When you have Lorelai and the Gilmore Girls debating with her daughter whether it's the Offspring or Metallica that they should be listening to, you're in a whole different world than like the original, we could say, setting of heavy metal. So we can't just go by album sales or polling casual fans. You're not going to get at the real stuff. So then what's the real stuff? That's the question we're trying to settle here. And whose views should we be taking into consideration? We want to take into consideration those who have experience, and so that would be both me and Scott on this sort of thing. We grew up with, and maybe some of our viewers and interlocutors growing up within that era probably gives you some insights. Then again, having some retrospective looking at it could also be helpful, but also expertise. And this is where Scott is particularly important. I can talk about, why, for example, Peace of Mind is a good contender for being the best Iron Maiden album. I don't have the technical chops quite so much to talk about that, except maybe in lyrical content or something along those lines. Whereas Scott can tell us why the sound sounds the way it does, and why, when we get to the killer to filler stuff, maybe why some of that is the way it is. So let's start out with talking about our first poll. We started with Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
And the polling was kind of interesting. But we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to give you the results of my polling. Somebody else, then Scott will present his pick and why he thinks it is that case. I'll present mine, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A and discussion. So when I polled, Number of the Beast came out as number 1, closely followed by Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, and then Peace of Mind, Power Slave, and Somewhere in Time. And so this is kind of interesting because what it shows us is there's a key era that a lot of people think to be like the definitive Maiden era, running from Number of the Beast to Somewhere in Time, and then Seventh Son is kind of an interesting outlier. There were other people who said other albums, Killers got a few, but not an awful lot. Brave New World got a few, Fear of the Dark, but those are the ones that were really big. Now, Paul Travers in Kerrang, and I wanted to go to like the best metal magazine, I thought, to get this. When he did this polling, Seventh Son was kind of a runaway winner, followed by Power Slave, Number of the Beast, Somewhere in Time, and Peace of Mind. So you notice it's the same five, right? There's some consistency there, but how it figures in is a little bit different. So before we do that, what do you make of this consistency and divergence, Scott? What do you think?
I was really curious when you put it up if Seventh Son, if that era, the Somewhere in Time Seventh Son era, was going to get any love at all.
Now, why?
I think they're great albums, but like for the hardcore fans, I remember when those albums came out, much like Turbo, which we'll be talking about, they introduced a slick sound and keyboards.
Yeah.
And so I think for people our age at the time, that was kind of like a jolt. Like, you go to the record store, you buy the album and you put it on your turntable and you go, what band is this? But it's interesting now with even the younger generation, they're having a chance to look back at the album that came out 35 years ago, probably 20 years before they were born, and go, well, this is cool. I think there's a difference in the audience. So I'd be curious of people's age that voted.
Oh yeah, if we had those stats, that could make a difference.
Because I have a lot of students at Berkeley that are Seventh Son fans, and I am too. I love that album, but I mean, is it my favorite? Probably not. But I think what to make of it is, I think all of them have really strong writing. I mean, Peace of Mind.
Yeah.
And, well, even Killers. Let's go to Killers, where they had less of a budget, or the first album where they had no budget. So you're talking. It's complete attitude, and then you have a huge budget at Seventh Son, but you still have great writers. I mean,
yeah,
Adrian Smith and of course.
That's interesting because the really early stuff, we're talking primarily Steve Harris doing the writing, and as time goes on, we see Adrian Smith getting more and more of a role in it. I mean, do you think we can associate the Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son? We can say, well, what happens is there's much more influence of Adrian Smith on the sound.
Yeah, I mean, Smith wrote Wasted Years, which is a must play in their set. And Adrian said he preferred those two albums. I think that's why they split. From what I understand, he just said he wanted to keep doing the Seventh Son thing. The band wanted to go back to being kind of a rock thing. And so he went off and did Adrian Smith and Project, which was not exactly Somewhere in Time, but, more polished.
Okay. So what is your pick?
So this is
Iron Maiden albums. You got to pick just one.
Yeah. It was a toss up between Killers. If we're looking at like the Paul Di'Anno era, well, we talk about this distinction between Clive Burr and Paul Di'Anno, where it was like, I love Clive Burr's drumming. The rhythm section was amazing. They were an amazing band, and they were young and hungry, and they barely had any money. And it kind of like the performance came through on the album. But I'm going to have to go all in all with Peace of Mind, which has fantastic songs on it, really fantastic songs. And the production is great. For the time that came out, it was mixed really well. I just feel like everybody's choice for sounds, there wasn't a whole lot of sounds on that album, as far as like, they weren't playing with keyboards, they weren't putting many effects on the guitar, but the way that it was played had attitude. And of course, when they went and did the tour, well, Greg and I agreed that no live albums, because you could argue it's a best of, but then the live versions, I've seen Maiden a bunch of times, of these songs are pretty outstanding. And I think just for a song, as far as song and kind of being in that raw era, Peace of Mind. And that was really hard for me. That was the hardest one.
very hard for me too. And I'm actually going to say Killers. I if I was doing a listing, Peace of Mind would come second for a lot of the same reasons. I think Peace of Mind is one of the consistently heavy albums.
Yeah.
I really like the sound on it, and it's got some, absolutely killer tracks. Killers, I mean, maybe I'm making a wrong decision in this, because so the studio album, it's Paul Di'Anno, who's not Bruce Dickinson. Paul Di'Anno is good but not great, I would say. But the songs are really great. And once you actually have Bruce Dickinson in there singing them, they shine more than with Paul Di'Anno. And I was thinking, like, Steve Harris's bass playing. I think one of the things that attracted me to Iron Maiden in the very beginning was the first album I had was Peace of Mind, and those constant bass fills that he's doing, it's just incredible. It's like, I'm blanking on the name of the drummer Neil Peart with drumming for Rush. You never know what's happening next, right? But it always fits. Steve Harris is like that on the bass. And I think that's part of what set Iron Maiden apart from some of their competitor bands at the time. But that's there on Killers. And the guitars are maybe a little bit less assertive on Killers than they are in the first two albums than they are on the albums after that. But I think Killers, that's the one for me. So let's open this up to our participants and see what do they think is the best Iron Maiden album, and why. Well, that's what we're really most interested in, is the why criterion.
Why, yeah. But it's interesting, we both picked Killers. You have to remember, like, they didn't have a lot of money for mastering, and a lot of these bands would say, okay, well, the cheapest the studio is 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. and you have to go in there and set up and record in those hours, where later on Iron Maiden could spend a year and make an album if they wanted.
That's crazy, going in that time of night.
But having the performance come out that good, I mean, there's something to say about the age you're at. It's kind of like the old saying with musicians, or what happened to Miles Davis a lot. It's like, why aren't you putting out albums like when you were 18? That was like the real raw stuff. And the answer is always, because I'm not 18 anymore. And so, and I always see albums as a snapshot of that time. Sometimes we see artists that become a put on of themselves, where it made sense when they were in their early 20s to be that reckless, but then they're in their 50s.
Though, with Iron Maiden, and I think we can say this about quite a few of the other artists that we're looking at while we're waiting for people to weigh in. So consistently good albums coming out almost like on the year, along with tours going on. That's pretty amazing to be able to do, right? Because you got Iron Maiden 1980, right? Killers is 81, I think. Right. And then Number of the Beast 83, Peace of Mind 84, or is Power Slave 84?
I thought Peace of Mind was 83.
83, yeah. So they're a fortiori, right? It's even closer time, and they're just churning these out and touring and doing all the other things, going on TV shows and stuff like that. Here's Ken. He says, Peace of Mind, top-notch songwriting, includes a classic lineup with Bruce and Nico, has an amazing production that stood the test of time. I think that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's nothing dated about Peace of Mind, right? Phenomenal album, is Maiden at their very best. I wish they'd remaster it with an additional part for Yannick. No, that's going to make Scott mad. You're not a big Yannick fan, right?
Oh, he seems like a wonderful person. I don't, this being an artist myself, but Greg and I joke, when Yannick stayed in the band, it was kind of, he doesn't match up with the other players. His time isn't the same. And, he just took over a bunch of the solos live and didn't play them as well. And a lot of people say he's a great showman, but I don't know, maybe it's just the cranky old man in me going, that's not the real old band. But Yannick's, he's a fine player. It's, sometimes it's just kind of like, I don't think he was the best choice for Maiden, but he stood the test of time. And how long has he been in there? Since 1990?
Yeah, actually that basically makes him now an integral part of it. Chris
Yeah.
says number one, Peace of Mind, because Nico completes the classic sound. Number two, Number of the Beast, because Bruce debuts. Now that's an interesting thing. A lot of people did in fact say that in my informal polling. They were like, well, you know, this is the album where this guy came on. Power Slave, because Rhyme, I think probably So Great, not so great, right? And then here's a question for you. Chris says he wants to hear your opinion on the 2015 Maiden remasters.
If I'm okay, there was a series of remasters that was garbage, because what remastering is, for those of you that don't know what actually happens, they take the original tapes. What happened when we had CDs first is they simply dumped the mastering from the LP onto a CD. And so we remember back in the day where we have like AAD, analog, digital, or DDD meant it was original from the beginning, digital from the beginning. What they do with the remasters, they're supposed to raise the levels. Like the best remastering I ever heard was the Steely Dan box set. I forgot the guy that did it. But mastering will make or break an album.
Yeah.
Well, the 2015 ones that there became a trend where, and I still buy these albums that are pretty much white noise. So the compression about 13 or 15 is pushing it. Some of these are compression of 3, which is ridiculous. So I got Somewhere in Time because they had it in stock at the store, and I put it in my car, and it was white noise. I couldn't hear, and the drums and the vocals were in the same register, because compression means you squish it all.
Okay.
Right? And the reason they squish it is because it's louder, and people are like, we want our album to be louder than the next person's. Not, you know, and these are A&R people calling the shots, not musicians. They don't understand that we have a volume knob. And when you play stuff on the radio, everything's the same volume because they have their own compression. So, you know, to give you an honest answer, I'm trying to think, maybe it was because they did a few remasters in the 2015. Maybe those were okay, but one of the remasters, I bought a few of them, and it was garbage, and I wanted my money back. The original sounded better because they were squishing it so much they wanted the volume to be loud. And that's something, you know, if you purchase a CD, a lot of the new bands, you'll hear and and when the vocals come in, the snare drum disappears. That's a good thing to listen to.
I think for a lot of bands, particularly in the metal genre, but I mean this could apply to others, you definitely want to be able to hear a separation between what the bass is doing compared to what the guitar is doing, even if they're doing the thing where they're doubling up on the same riff, you know, like think about old Black Sabbath stuff. You want to be able to hear Butler's bass and Iommi's guitar as separate things. And right. I think some of the remastering can lose that, right?
And well, just Chris, maybe those are the ones. God, time just flies. Maybe those are the ones I picked up. And I know there's a big gap. There's about 20 years gap in that, but didn't they?
So Ken says didn't they get disowned by Steve Harris? I don't know. That's a good question.
You mean the Masters?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, that happened to Gene Simmons. Everybody said that was.
The 98 remasters, he's saying.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I have to pick up the 2015. I have a lot of the original ones, and I've got them on vinyl. But people backstage were complaining years ago when Kiss remastered their stuff, or pre. They're like, your CDs sound awful. So Gene Simmons actually went to a record store and bought a bunch of Kiss CDs and put them in and said, you know what? They're right. And then he had all the Kiss catalog remastered. So that's
interesting.
An interesting thing.
Yeah, that's definite quality control there. So well, let's jump into talking criteria. So we wanted to use the Iron Maiden one as a launching point. I mentioned that we don't want this. We don't want to like try to have a popularity contest thing. Why not? Well, because it's what we can call an extrinsic criteria. It's something accidental, something contingent. Some other criteria that are more that way, they're not really on point. It's the first album I listened to. Some people chose, various albums because of that. And you can say, well, that's cool. That's part of your backstory. But why would that make it best? Best in a more objective sense rather than just best for you. It's subjective in the problematic sense, meaning arbitrary. Like if I went by that criterion, then I would indeed pick Peace of Mind for my, it was the first Iron Maiden album I listened to, Defenders of the Faith for Judas Priest, but I'd be picking Motorhead's Orgasmatron, and that's definitely not their best album. Or well, with the other two, I mean, except Balls to the Wall is the one I picked, and I do actually think that's their best album. But it's really arbitrary what first album somebody encountered, right? We want to be able to say why something is better. Now, another really interesting criterion, a historical criterion that was given is the album is important because it was influential on other bands. So there were a lot of people who said except Restless and Wild and Motorhead's Overkill were their best. Why? Because they kicked off speed metal. Arguably, that is the case. You could say a similar thing. Then, like, you'd have to think about, like, well, what's the best Venom album? Obviously, black metal, because that kicks off black metal. It's definitely not their best produced album. I don't know if it's even their best album, but that is kind of interesting to think about that historical role. Would that mean that Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath is their best album? Which, I mean, you could make a case for that, but I don't, I don't know. I mean, what do you think about this, Scott? This making something the best album because it kicks off a kind of new history. It's really an argument from innovation.
What's interesting before I answer, and I'm just saying this because Greg posted something very cool, a tribute to Dio, and some of it was his interviews. And there's one where Dio's on a tour bus and they hand him each album he was on from the very first one. And there's some criteria that I'm seeing Dio go by. He'll say, well, this was an okay record, but it's really important to me because this is the first time I got to play with Richie Blackmore. And then, so he put this in the good pile, but not because he thought it was the best performed album, or this was great because I got to work with so-and-so.
Yeah.
It was a slow process. So even the artists themselves but I like how he made the distinction of, okay, this is great, but he'll say, not because the performance of the songs were the best, but it's important to me. So I think that you're saying this, we're kind of saying the same thing in the sense that, like, as far as a movement, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at we've talked about this a number of times, influence. How does influence actually work causally, sociologically? What is influence? When you look at bands in the 1980s, like say in the thrash scene, right? You ask them, okay, well, who are your main influences? And they'll say, like, oh, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead. And then they often in the interviews don't go much further than that, but sometimes they will actually mention an album that was like key for them. Lars Ulrich was somebody who would do that. Andy had something kind of interesting here, coming back to the first album I listened to. She said, Peace of Mind is the first she heard. That might be the reason, but it will always hit a bit differently. That said, Can I Play with Madness, 22 Acacia Avenue, Wasted Years, or songs I'd feel sad or cheated if I didn't hear in concert.
Yeah.
Because it opened up my way of experiencing them as a band. And I think that's an important topic in its own right. What's different about like sitting in your bedroom with your turntable and going out to see them as a band. Like sometimes you can go and the performance can be very similar to what you're actually hearing on the LP, and people sometimes feel cheated when that's the case, right? They're like, I could have just sat home and listened to the album. I want to hear something a bit different.
You want the live experience. I always say, as far as performance, you want the experience, for better or for worse, of the band that day. If we were talking Iron Maiden, Bruce Dickinson didn't get his cup of tea before and he's mad. Or, they played soccer that day and it didn't go well. Or, and I think that's part of any kind of live art is, sometimes you'd hear like I'd hear live albums that were bootlegs, and they weren't quite right, but there was something to them. So I kept listening to them. It's like, well, the drums are dragging a little bit here and here, but there's something kind of cool about the snapshot of that moment, even though it's not perfection. And then there's bands out there, I know we all know, that are playing to tracks. And then we had that whole debate of, well, should we have Dio as a hologram? No, because Dio can't respond to the energy of the crowd. You're not getting a live experience. This is more of like a, to me, it's if the crowd's dull, Dio will be the same. If the crowd's going berserk, Dio's the same. And what you're doing is you're pulling away the live experience of.
That's a really interesting one, because Dio was such a focused on the audience performer to the very end, and he talks about that in interviews. It's clear that when he gets out there and he's like, hello Milwaukee, he's not just reading off a cue card like some of these bands that have no idea where the hell they are, and they're like, we always love coming back here because you're the best. He wouldn't bullshit like that. Whereas I think some other people might be tempted to do that. In which case they could be hologrammable.
Well, yeah, but there's a difference with Dio, and it's so funny. I don't know if you ever caught a lot of bands I've seen over the years. They'll ask someone what's the major route here? And around me, there's 495.
Okay.
So the singer would be like, we were coming down Route 495 to the show today. And the crowd would go berserk, right?
Yeah.
And see all these. And then sometimes I've heard people name the wrong state they're in. That's happened a couple of occasions. You just hear, ooh, of the crowd.
Yeah.
But I think, what Andy says, you do want to hear those as part of a live experience. I love those tunes too.
Yeah.
Acacia Avenue, I don't think I've ever heard them do that live. And I love that one.
I wonder, we saw them here. I've actually heard them do it live, but it was back in the 90s. We saw them here in 2012 here in Milwaukee. I don't remember if they did it or not. Oh, Andy says they did play it at Summerfest 2012. Okay. Yeah. So that's actually a good segue back. Another thing that we could look at as a criterion is what the band members or the key band members thought about the album. So, Steve Harris, there's things out there where he says Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is great stuff, and he stands behind it. That getting Steve Harris, I think that's probably more important than going to Nico McBain or McBrain and saying, what do you think about it, right? And in Motorhead, obviously what Lemmy thinks probably matters more than any other member, although he was always pretty gracious in letting whoever else he's got playing with him to weigh in on stuff. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, and this is something that Scott and I have talked about quite a bit, when bands put together set lists, maybe that's a criterion of not just what they think the crowd wants to hear, but also what they consider to be their best material. Unless they're feeling like they're selling out or something. We're Warrant, we have to put Cherry Pie, even though we hate playing the song, we're stuck playing it. But when you look at what bands and the bands that we're looking at here, these are all bands that could call their own shots. When Judas Priest goes out on the road, nobody's really telling them, you have to put this in the set list, you have to put this in the set list. It's up to them. If they wanted to do 5 editions of Green Man Alicia, I don't think anybody would stop them, right? So maybe that's a sign of what they think to be the best. Or we could also ask what songs go into best of or live albums when they're best of albums that the band themselves produce and not something that the record company puts out.
Or somebody else wrote for a movie soundtrack for them.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Aerosmith, you'll never hear them play the Diane Warren stuff. You raise a great point, because Iron Maiden, they weren't made by radio. They weren't on the radio.
They had a hard time getting on the radio out here in the Midwest.
Well, they were, yeah. I mean, I guess the only song that really made it was Wasted Years. That was on MTV. But besides that, now you take a band like Def Leppard, where the Stereo album was always on the radio every hour. Now a band like Def Leppard, they feel like they have to play that whole album, which they have since 1988. And why won't buy another ticket? But Iron Maiden, on the other hand, they well, when they did A Matter of Life and Death, they played the entire record of A Matter of Life and Death, and then they played like 4 or 5 of their classic stuff. Now that's courage to me, because people want to hear Run to the Hills or whatever, but Bruce Dickinson and Steve Harris didn't care. This is the new record. We're standing behind this.
So here's an interesting remark from Ken. Radio never played Maiden due to the longer song lengths. I think, though, there's also another, because we could say, well, what about Motorhead then? I mean, they had very short songs, and a lot of it was radio stations weren't going to play, even if they're hard rock, they weren't going to play a lot of metal stuff unless it was Whitesnake or Def Leppard. I mean, Dio was kind of an interesting exception. Dio managed to break in, and so did Black Sabbath. Really didn't, but Rainbow did. Rainbow's stuff got played,
especially the Joe and Turner stuff.
Well, I'm thinking also like Man on the Silver Mountain was kind of for like hard rock stations, that was kind of a staple. But I mean, once they went AOR, they were all over the place. Street of Dreams,
Yeah.
What was that? Since You've Been Gone.
Yep. But the new Maiden song will never be any best. I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah.
I've been warned.
Andy and I listened to and watched the video for the new Iron Maiden song, and it was kind of a disappointment. But that could be like a whole different topic for another time.
Well, if you take Dio, just to stay on the subject before we get off, but every time I saw Dio, I saw him on Killing the Dragon tour. He played 6 songs from that album. Magica, he played the whole album, and then Master of the Moon, which was a little more, I don't want to say poppy, but like I don't know, it was more catchy. He played those songs. So Dio was, he wasn't going to go out.
He's committed to the new music.
Yeah. In other words, I was talking to a friend that's in a huge metal band, and I was, kind of complaining about other bands' set lists. And he, as a joke, mentioned a certain band and said, well, their new album's not that good. I wouldn't play it either. Well, that's an interesting thing. Are you going to go, we can say, Greg, you and I do an album and we go, hey man, I can't wait to put this out. This is the best stuff we've done. Yeah. Of course we're going to play it live because we believe in it. But if we're like, hey, look, we owe the record company something, let's throw something together and then let's go to our hit set. I mean, I think it says a lot when the band comes out and says, whether you've heard it or not, whether you're going to go to the stand and buy $12 beers or not while we play this stuff, but we have this about we've talked in the past, are you playing for yourself or are you playing for the audience? I think in the metal case, it's okay to play for yourself because you have the diehards that have everything.
Yeah. I will say, and because Andy and I have been going to shows quite a bit pre-COVID, that the bands that we've seen really support their new stuff and had really good new stuff to support would be Judas Priest with the Firepower album. Saxon with the Thunderbolt album, Uriah Heep, and I'm blanking on their 2018 album was. I can see like the picture of it because it's got the moon thing. That they played quite a few songs from that, which they could have easily just like stuck to playing, 20-minute long Gypsy or something like that, right? But they wanted to play their new stuff. Who else is really supporting their newer stuff?
I'm trying to think of. I enjoy it, even if I usually try to get the record first and listen to it, but I enjoy when I go see.
That's what we do too. Yeah.
I like, let's go back to, I don't know the age demographic of people that are here, but I remember going to see bands, and I would always go for the opening band in the 80s. And I'll never forget, and this isn't metal, but I could probably think of a metal example, but I'll never forget the band Survivor just got rid of the guy that was on Eye of the Tiger. And they got this new singer called Jimmy Jameson, and they had this new album out called Vital Signs. This was 1985. And I went to see REO Speedwagon. And when I went there, they played pretty much the new album for their hour set. And my jaw was dropped how good the songs were. And I remember going, I came here to see REO Speedwagon, but I want to go out and see if I could buy this album. So, I think
Yeah.
even now, if a band's like, hey, we're going to play 4 from the new album, I'm listening. And if it grabs me, I'm at the merch booth, wow, that was really good. So I think a lot of people won't give it a chance. I don't know, like, how did you feel? Did you have any like bands kind of like open? You're like, who are these guys? And then they win you.
Opening bands, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question.
Oh, did you?
Black Star Riders played with Judas Priest and Saxon, and Black Star Riders is basically Scott Gorham, and so it's what Thin Lizzy transformed into, because they decided they would play as Thin Lizzy, but they'd only play Thin Lizzy songs and not create any new songs, and then any new stuff that they would make, because Phil Lynot's been dead all this time.
Right.
And Gorham really isn't an original member.
No.
He got brought in. So they thought, well, we'll have a new band, and they're pretty good. We didn't buy their album. Andy says that she did with the band that opened for AC/DC, The Answer.
Oh, cool. I don't know them.
Yeah, well, she goes to see AC/DC with her mom, so that's
Oh, that's
a
right.
whole
That's
different
cool.
thing. I remember when, and this is interesting, there was a Twitter conversation about AC/DC at the Madison Coliseum in 1990, and they had Love Hate there. And Love Hate actually got booed off stage because people were there to see AC/DC. And I think Love Hate got like 4 or 5 songs in, and people were like, booing, and they left, sometimes, and I guess they were pretty good, but they weren't what the AC/DC crowd wanted. So
It's like when I saw Wasted open for Iron Maiden, people.
yeah, I remember you telling me about
And,
this. Yeah,
they were more like an AOR band.
yeah,
But I was really into it. They were kind of polished. The harmonies were fantastic. And I actually bought the record, but they didn't make it 5 songs before they got booed off stage.
yeah. And it's kind of sad because they were there because Steve Harris really likes Pete Way, and
I know.
wanted them to open for them.
And another funny thing, Steve Harris is a huge Journey fan. So he always says,
Oh, right.
he always plays Journey for their PA music. And because people will boo it from the crowd. Then he goes, but I'm a big fan. I love that stuff. And, it's kind of like, it might seem a little weird, but it makes sense because I think, if we're talking about Steve Harris, he knows how to write a good song, and he doesn't care what genre it is. If it's a good song, he's going to listen and maybe pick something up. But I think it's important with these metal bands that it's unlike Def Leppard, they're not stuck to anything. They can do whatever they want because the crowd are really diehards. The Def Leppard people are the people our age that want to relive their drunk summer of 1988 or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's being liberated by your success, and then there's being prisoners of your own success, right?
But that was another discussion, or there'll have to be another discussion on whether we agree with Def Leppard on that. But that's another day.
Well, let's talk about another major criterion that came up, and there's actually a name for this: the killer to filler ratio. So you're looking at the album, and you're looking at all the tracks, and we could say, well, how much of the album is really solid, excellent tracks, stuff that you don't skip over? I think that's one part of it. And then it needs to have sort of an integrity as an album. I'm not saying it has to be a concept album, because concept album, they actually get away with that. You're going to listen to the whole album because otherwise you're missing the experience, right? So like Operation Mindcrime, you're not going to skip over stuff except maybe where the people are talking and you're like, this is a little bit too over the top for me. But if you listen to Peace of Mind, do you skip over Quest for Fire, or To Tame a Land, or Sun and Steel? Or if you're listening to Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast, do you jump right over Invaders that a lot of people don't like? I mean, I listen to the whole album if I'm listening to the whole album. But like if I'm listening to Ozzy Osbourne's Bark at the Moon, I'm not listening to So Tired,
Oh, no. There's a lot of skip songs on there for me, although I was a big Ultimate Sin fan.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a stronger album, actually.
Yeah, I agree. But like, the 2 Randy Rhoads albums, just leave them on. I mean, those are unbelievable. Diary of a Madman. I just heard a week ago, and I was like, you know when it's been years since you've heard an album you loved, and I
Yeah.
went back to that and go, wow, this is even better than I thought it was. It really stood the test of time.
That's a nice experience when you listen to it and you're like, oh, there's more going on here. Actually, I'm going to indulge in a little bit of storytelling that goes completely off topic. So, Scott and I both like grew up with this music, as I think many of the people involved here are as well. And then by like the mid 90s, I was playing bass. I had gotten much more into grunge. I was still listening to like some of the 90s metal, like Alice in Chains, and even weird stuff like Prong, but I was listening to less and less of the classic stuff. And then what got me back into it was actually there was a long documentary that had 4 parts to it, and I think it was VH1 put it out, and it was about heavy metal, and I was watching it in the early 2000s, and I was watching it and listening to the stuff that they were playing, and I was like, this is actually pretty good musically. Why did I quit listening to this stuff? And so then I went like on, CD buying sprees, and I just go to used CD stores, and like, if I had friends who had a lot, I'd download that onto my computer, and then, just started listening to more and more and more. And then of course, later on discovered Pandora with the Musical Genome Project. And this opened up massive things to, growing up in the Midwest, unless you had money and could go to the big cities, you couldn't get the metal import stuff very easily. I mean, you could order it, but it was a total crapshoot ordering anything from like Circus or Hit Parader stuff. Metal Blade would have their things, and then there'd be all this European import stuff. But we didn't have the money for that, so there were all these bands and albums that I'd never actually heard. And so there was that got me back into it. And it was hearing and saying, oh, wow, there's something here. There's something more than what I'd remembered, to bring it back to Scott's point. So Ken and Chris are posting in about Sun and Steel. There is actually a lager that Iron Maiden has released supporting Sun and Steel. So that's a good vote. I mean, I actually think I like the whole Peace of Mind album myself. I don't skip stuff, but I know that some people do pan those songs.
That's interesting. Has anybody tried the beer? I'm curious.
I think we bought the Trooper beer a while back.
Oh, okay.
Back when Andy and I were still living in New York.
And
I think we had to order it, if I remember right. Does that sound right, Andy?
You mean through a liquor store?
No, I think we had to like order it online.
They let you order? Like, how come you can't be 15 and order it? I never understood how you could order alcohol online.
Good question.
It's illegal in Massachusetts.
Well, you just said Massachusetts.
You're right.
Not exactly the land of liberty,
No.
Oh, this is interesting from Ken. If there's one track that doesn't really fit the album, ironically, it's the Trooper. I'd like to hear why. To me, that does fit the album, particularly when you put it up with Where Eagles Dare, and Die With Your Boots On, both lyrically but also musically. But let's jump back to this killer to filler ratio. So does an album have to have no bad songs in order to be the best album? I would say yeah. I would say you can't have anything that is there's questionable, right? Where people disagree about it, and then there's like, no, this is not good,
There's and we go back to the Aristotle stuff with contempt. As a fan in any genre, if I bought an album, there was clearly 2 things put on there that the band put no thought into, or was a joke song, or it was a really bad cover we never needed to hear again, poorly done. What would I just spend $7.99 on? It's kind of like you couldn't have written 2 more songs, and I think initially that, you know, there's the questionable, like, okay, this was not as strong, like you said, and then there's the blatant. You just ran out of stuff and just said, okay, just throw the stuff on, and well, you know, like with cassettes, you know.
Well, you know, with the really good albums, they very often are coming from times when the band was just totally fertile. You know, like Motorhead. I was watching this interview with Fast Eddie Clark yesterday, and he was talking about how they were going to the recording studio and they had too much material to put onto an album. Stuff was just like coming out of them, basically. I think that's part of what makes for a great album.
Oh yeah, where people said, you know, we've recorded, you know, 20 songs. Now we really got to cut it down, and it's going to be difficult. So, you know, they're going to take they're going to be very careful onto what ends up on the album. Well, you know, just it's funny because I guess what was the Stones record right before Tattoo You was but anyways, Tattoo You, when it came out, had all the hits, was all the stuff they wrote for the last album that didn't make it on the album. So they made Tattoo You.
Yeah,
That was all the stuff that didn't make it on the last album, which
Judas Priest did that with Ram It Down. A good bit of that was stuff that didn't make it onto Turbo.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And there was another band that did a similar kind of thing, and I'm blanking on it right now, back in the 80s as well. Well, let's actually, we brought up Judas Priest. Let's talk about the Judas Priest polling so we can keep this moving along. So when I did the polling, it was very interesting. Painkiller got the most votes, and then Sin After Sin, British Steel were tied, Stained Class, and then Sad Wings of Destiny. And Painkiller is kind of an outlier in that way, because you look at when all these others are coming in, and the others that did get votes. So some of the other albums that people did like were Point of Entry, Screaming for Vengeance, Defenders of the Faith, you know, everything from Sad Wings basically all the way to Defenders of the Faith. And then Turbo didn't get any. Ram It Down didn't get any. Painkiller, a lot of people felt that to be like a new resuscitated Judas Priest. And you look at that album, it's really got a lot of great tracks on it. It's kind of, in some ways, an advance in their sound, but also return to the really heavy stuff. The Kerrang vote that Paul Travers did, this is interesting. Defenders of the Faith got #1, followed by British Steel, then Painkiller, and then Screaming for Vengeance and Sin After Sin. I'm not sure how he wound up with that, because I actually think Defenders is a really great album, and that was the first album that I listened to, and I also think that's their heaviest album. But I don't run into too many people who see things that way. So he must have polled those people.
Right.
So do you have any reactions to this listing? Or?
Well, you know, Painkiller is a fantastic album. And I think I mentioned to you that I'd be as great of as an album. I thought it would be disqualified by fans because it was it 1990, right?
It was later, yeah.
So it was later, and it was kind of like, well, to the diehards, it's, you know, it's always the joke. Well, the early stuff was the real stuff, you know. But Painkiller was their heaviest album up until when that came out. That must have just punched people in the face. It was just, they were back, and I think it was important. It was just kind of like, you know, for a band to have such a big catalog, to come up with, you know, you figure, okay, our best work's done, we'll just do our best from here on out. For them to make a record that people go, whoa, this is like the best thing you've done, that's an accomplishment. And it is a killer album. I am surprised it came in first.
Well, I think it edged out those others because the others were dividing the allegiance between them. Right. That's a
good point.
Sin After Sin and British Steel each got 2/3 the votes that Painkiller had. So you put them together, they've got more votes. And then you add Stained Class in there, and Sad Wings of Destiny, and Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather. And you've got way more than Painkiller. So it almost like breaks down into 2 eras, or 3 eras if we want to say put Sad Wings and Sin After Sin together, and then everything, from the late 70s to the 80s. Chris says, "Victim of Change's rules. He wants to hear you play it on guitar." Yeah, I mean, going back to the Painkiller album, it's got Painkiller on it, which is always in their set lists.
Yes.
Um,
Which is, I don't want to stop you there, but as far as students that are 18 to 20, most of them are using that as a benchmark to look cool still. I mean, you've got the new guitarists of now, but
that's interesting.
The Painkiller solo is like they all want to do it for their proficiency test.
Well, when we got to see Judas Priest in concert, there were some times when Halford was clearly having some health problems, and then most recently, the last two tours that we've seen them on, he was firing on all cylinders. And watching him do Painkiller on stage, he's using these techniques to like get the most out of his lungs and his body. It's like an athletic performance. And I was asking my daughter, who's a vocal person, about this, and she was saying, yeah, he's doing that for this reason and that for this reason. I think that's probably one of the most demanding vocal songs that Judas Priest has, and it's really to his credit that Rob Halford can still do it today. So it's interesting to hear that guitarists are also as interested in it as vocalists are.
And then who why would the band think in 77 or in 83 that wow, the best guitar solo I'm going to do is yet to come in 10 years,
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting in that way, but this is why I kind of brought it up at the beginning. What are the age of the people? If you were born in the year 2000, well, you're at least 20 years. That album came out 20 years before you were born. We could take out the criteria bit of, well, British Steel came out when I was in high school or anything. It's just, they hear it. And
we used to drink beer at bonfires, listening to that on the car stereo. Yeah. That's a whole lost age, I think.
But kind of like when we talk about why, I think for the younger generation, it's kind of like I mean, Led Zeppelin was still playing when I was a kid, but really they didn't get huge until the 80s in my school. Everybody had the Zeppelin albums, and to me it didn't matter because they didn't come out, as I remember, somebody maybe a generation above me, so I judge them a little different, I guess, that I didn't have the personal experience with each that came out.
Yeah. Well, let's talk our two bests. What do you think is the best Judas Priest album?
I'm gonna go with Screaming for Vengeance.
Why?
The songs are unbelievable. Turbo is the first one I heard because there used to be a metal show. Remember, we'd hear metal late at night.
Right.
And when that album came out, Turbo was on, and I thought it was cool, in the sense that I love this guy's voice, so it's not like a first album thing. I just think song wise, I mean, it's not like they're not all great, but for some reason I always go back to that album. You've got Well, Take These Chains. Remember, I was so ecstatic they did it last tour, and I don't remember them ever doing it before.
Yeah.
You got Another Thing Coming. That pre-chorus to me with those guitars it's just so gets you pumped up. Bloodstone's a great riff.
I think every song on that album is a great song. I'm just going to look at very quickly to refresh my brain. Is there any filler on Screaming for Vengeance? I don't think so.
Although I think I got one that had bonus tracks. I'm looking it up now.
Well, so the 2001 CD one that had Prisoner of Your Eyes and Devil's Child, is that what you're thinking of? Because Prisoner of Your Eyes, I actually like that one. I think that's a great ballad.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's was it British and Steel that has that Hendrixy kind of ballad? What's it called? Summer. Why am I blanking?
British Steel.
It's something Summer. Why? I don't know why I'm blanking out. Is it British Steel or?
I don't think so.
God, somebody help me out.
Well, in any case, so I think Screaming for Vengeance, that's definitely a contender for best album. And I was going to say Sin After Sin, but I think I'm going to agree with you on that, because Sin After Sin is really, really great. Oh yeah, Last Rose of Summer.
That's what. I just looked it up. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, Sin After Sin has got a wider range than Screaming for Vengeance does, and with less songs.
But that one was like a surprise at first, and going back and listening to that, it's very Hendrixy. It's kind of like that Little Wing kind of thing on it. And you know what? They sound really good doing it.
Oh
It's not like, oh, listen to these metal guys try to be sensitive. It's really fancy.
Well, you know, this is like totally off topic, but you know, Rob Halford is gay and famously had to, you know, be in the closet for a long time. I don't see how anybody doesn't get that when you listen to Sin After Sin. You know, as Andy pointed out to me a long time ago, one entire song, Raw Deal, is about going to Fire Island, and there's no question that it's not like he's going there to meet some woman. You know, it's very clearly about that. Last Rose of Summer could be about a love affair, you know, that way. There was another one as well, but there's also some really, you know, awesome other songs too. But Raw Deal is a great song, you know. All right. Well, let's ask people, what do you think the best Judas Priest?
Oh, thanks. Actually, Andy, I'm sorry I didn't see you chime in. Thank you. You did save me before I looked it up.
What do all the rest of you think the best Judas Priest album is, and why?
Yeah, I'm dying to know. That was these are really hard for me. Did you find it really hard? And I remember when you put up the things.
I found Judas Priest the hardest one to decide myself. Iron Maiden would be like maybe the second hardest to decide. For Accept and Dio, it wasn't. It was sort of like an automatic gut reaction for me.
And I'm gonna have surprise ones for those. I'll probably be
okay.
On these.
All right. So Andy says she gave up trying to decide. Ken said Painkiller is an obvious choice, but it's less cerebral than their earlier stuff.
Yeah, Painkiller was their heaviest, but I agree, Ken.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I would say Defenders is heavier. But you think Painkiller is a heavier album than Defenders?
Well, here's okay. So this is where Greg usually brings me in. Sonically, because where we're at 1990, there's now production techniques and effects and new amps on the market that, you know, there could be more distortion on the guitar. There's, you know, different vocal effects where it's the production is actually making it heavy, as well as the band's performance.
Okay.
Where if you go back to, let's just say, early albums from the mid 70s, any band, put two mics in the middle of the room and just go, well, they're using what they have. Like, you know, technology hasn't gone that far yet. And it wasn't 1990 wasn't too different. It was just, you were in the production, you know, the way they would mix the snare or whatever, they would, you know, the way the guitars came through. In the past, they'd pan them and have less gain. The bass would push it. And by 1990, production trends have changed. So, you know, what we've decided is if we had them play both albums in their entirety live, and then we can decide.
Oh,
you know, like, so we would get today's present day rig that they have the guitarists and everything. And they would go, you know what, Greg, you're right. That is a heavier album. But like the tune Painkiller is just really heavy. The tune itself.
Yeah. Well, that's the one that kind of stands out. Whereas with
Killer No Filler.
Well, with Defenders of the Faith, right? So Free Will Burning, Jawbreaker, The Sentinel, some Heads Are Gonna Roll.
Oh yeah.
Those are all like super heavy. And even Night Comes Down, which is their ballad on there, even that is a heavy ballad. It's not like a lot of the stuff that was being, it's just slower. It's in a way it's not really a ballad.
Right.
It's just a slower song. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I would say that one of the things that changes in terms of heaviness is in terms of technique is the drumming from mid 80s to like 90s, using the like very precise drumming. You hear that in a lot of metal bands. It's almost like there's too much drumming going on. That's one way to make things heavier. What
And
they're doing
that'll,
with the bass drums.
yeah, between 1980 and 1990, a lot of thrash was coming out,
Right.
and the double kick drum, and
Yeah.
um, so
Are
they,
there any like important innovations in terms of bass stuff around that time, or not, or is that just basically following what the guitars are doing?
well, you mean as far as an approach to playing?
Yeah, and making things sound heavier. I mean, or are they just using the same, like, echoing the riff, pedal notes, the same kind of stuff as was done in the early 80s?
I, so Greg will know this too, but a classic, I think for any genre, my favorite sound is a Fender bass through an Ampeg, and you would turn the Ampeg up loud, and it would push the tubes, and you get a growl out of it. And Lemmy's an extreme example of that. Well, he actually had distortion pedals.
Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
think the classic use of bass in the 70s and early 80s is the heaviest sound because it was very clear. It had some hair on it.
yeah.
Bass started to get, not with everybody, of course, but bass started to clean up in the mixes so it could cut through it a different way because the guitar
Right. It's got
was
that more tubular sound to it.
it was, yeah, we just so. And then like in the 90s, I remember everybody having these like new Trace Elliott amps with bass, and it was cleaner and it would cut through the mix, but I was like, I don't like that. And then when I went on a gig with a bass player with the Ampeg, I said, now we're talking.
Yeah.
No, it's just for heaviness sake.
We have some more weigh-ins on the Judas Priest. So Chris says sad wings and screaming because all killer, no filler.
I love it.
That's true. I mean, I think there's a lot of Judas Priest albums that we can say that about, where there just isn't a bad song on them. And then Ken says Sad Wings is definitely an all-time classic heavy rock album. Defenders also had an amazing master and mix for the time. That's interesting.
It does actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I like we were talking about vocal effects. I brought it up with Motorhead, but where Turbo was kind of, it's kind of like they backed off the processing like after Turbo. Like Heads Are Gonna Roll, that intro is so nasty. That guitar intro,
Yeah.
such a great riff, and and then you almost hear like a slapback on Halford's voice, and it's not super complicated, but it gives you this, like, when you listen to Heads Are Gonna Roll or stuff, anything off that album, it's kind of almost a 3D sound. There's depth to it.
Yeah.
So it's like, talk about getting lost into the tune when you're a kid with the headphones, entering a world. I do agree that I really like the mastering on that album.
The mastering, as you were pointing out, is just so absolutely central to whether an album is going to punch through or not. So, think about Peace of Mind and Number of the Beast, really great at the time. By contrast, Black Sabbath's 1983 Born Again, great album, great songs on there. And what holds it back is the bad mastering,
You have the mixing and the mastering, and if you screw either of those two up,
yeah,
it's lackluster.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to mention that the tour that followed, okay, that was messed up. That actually, like, some stuff figured into Spinal Tap. Ian Gillan had trouble, memorizing the lyrics and stuff like that. But the album itself is really, really good. But it could have been so much better. Let's talk about Motorhead. So the polling that I did, Ace of Spades basically ran away with it, I would say. And then people did say no sleep for Hammersmith till Hammersmith. We're going to put that aside. Overkill came in at number 2, and then Bomber, 1916, and Bastards. Louder Sound did a survey, and they also had Ace of Spades, Overkill, Bomber, Motorhead, and Another Perfect Day. So Ace of Spades, I think that's probably the one that most people know the most. And Overkill, it's nice to see that in number 2 on both, and then Bomber. It's good to see Another Perfect Day get some love because it's quite a good album. It's kind of a weird one-off because it's Brian Robertson who only plays on one album, and then he's sort of the transitional figure between the Fast Eddie, Phil Taylor, Motorhead, and then the later Wurzel, Phil Campbell, and then whoever's going to drum Motorhead that we know. So, what do you make of these choices? Should Ace of Spades run away with it, you think, or?
I mean, I understand why Ace of Spades ran away with it. I mean, it's the one I know the best. And actually, I went back. I have a few of them. I don't have the catalog. I'm not, like Maiden. I have the whole catalog, but I did enjoy going through the whole process, or some of the albums I never heard before. Just checking. I just figured, like, listening to them. Now we go back to what we started this whole subject with today, and it's, well, Ace of Spades was the one everybody seemed to know and talk about, but then when I looked at their discography, I'm going, oh my god, I didn't even know about this album.
They have a massive catalog following that, and I think with quite a few classic metal bands, we'd see it kind of gravitating towards the old end, and then, like, if you ask, like, what's the best Saxon album, right? I don't think people are going to say Thunderbolt or really anything after, like, Strong Arm of the Law, or they're only going to know the 80s stuff for the most part.
I mean, like, Denim and Leather was mine back in the day. Great album, but, like, they went on to get much heavier and put out albums after that, but I wonder if that stuff still exists in their set. Denim and Leather, that album.
Oh yeah, they did play stuff from.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I was gonna. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, one of the things that I think I mentioned to you that was interesting is Lemmy's vocal treatment on, let's say, Ace of Spades, and then just jumping a few years ahead to Another Perfect Day.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing what, there was an effect called the Boss CE1, and it was a chorus, and a chorus pedal is like a slight modulation, means it slightly detunes stuff to give it depth. And there was something about the CE1, the chips they actually used to build the effect actually gave it kind of a slapback effect. And it sounds like on Another Perfect Day, Lemmy's using it, and I think it sounds really cool. And but the thing is, they can't duplicate that sound because I guess those chips don't exist anymore. So either you find the old gear to duplicate that sound. So that's kind of a cool thing that,
yeah,
I think Another Perfect Day is a great album. But just in a 3-year difference, seeing how things changed production wise. I mean, really, was it 82 or 83 when Journey came out with Frontiers, and it's like no record we heard before with all this, chorus and reverb and all this stuff. I really think the trend hit right around 83, and we're kind of hearing that even with Motorhead. And then, as they go on, they could go back to whatever they want as far as sound, rather than, something new you got for Christmas, like, oh, hey, the record company's not going to put it out unless you have this new sound the kids like. I don't know what it was with Motorhead, but you do hear it in trends during the 80s.
Well, like, they are definitely not a group that was going to play nice with the record company on that sort of thing.
No, but I think, but maybe that's why it sounds so good, because Lemmy tried it out and said, this sounds great. It would, like, I can usually tell the year of, if somebody plays me something from the 80s, I'll tell you what year it came out by the production. It's because most of the time, and people play that game with me, and I just know the trends because when you're young, the years are long, and that
would be a fun game to play sometime here, actually.
Yeah.
Although we wouldn't be able to run the video, because as soon as any of the song stuff came up, we'd get immediately flagged on YouTube. So what did you pick as the best Motorhead album? Did you pick Ace of Spades or?
Ace of Spades.
Okay.
And this, mostly because of your criteria, I'm most familiar. Um, Iron Fist I listened. That's killer.
Yeah, that's a great
A
album.
great album. And I'm going to admit to maybe it's not the great album. I'm admitting that I know Maiden and Priest way better than Motorhead, but I did listen to all this stuff and take notes and go, this is a great album. This is a great album. And I'm thinking between like um 80 and 83 because Iron Fist was like between
82.
it was between those two, wasn't it? Yeah, 82.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's but Ace of Spades, I mean, and I'm picking it basically because most familiar, and I do love the album.
I had a hard time with this
I know you're a
because
much bigger Motorhead fan. That's
oh yeah, Overkill, Bomber, and Ace of Spades, all three of them kind of jockey for position in part because there are so many great classic Motorhead songs on them. The ones that really like stick in your head, the ones that are like absolutely classic Motorhead that they continued playing throughout their time as they kept churning out new stuff. But I'm actually going to go with Overkill, and the reason I'm going to go with Overkill is a little bit quirky. It's got two songs on it that are Motorhead songs, but a little bit different than their usual fare. They've got Capricorn and Metropolis, and they're both much more jazzy and trippy. And they allow Fast Eddie Clarke, who's got this really distinctive both style of playing and also like effects. He's got a lot of reverb on. He's a very lyrical kind of player. They let him really shine, especially Capricorn. The solos on that. That's the one that I would pick. Although the rest of these are great, and even the stuff that comes after it. I can't think of a bad Motorhead album, frankly.
yeah.
Throughout their discography, one where you're like, oh, this is a misstep. Who's
Um,
this? You know.
do you remember? There's this maybe Chris Ken. I'm sorry, will know. Remember years ago I said that British comedian that had that show, and he had these famous, like David Gilmour come out and like play another brick in the wall, and he was arguing a court case to a judge that they weren't having the right pictures on in the music to make it easy to play the songs, like the finger diagrams. And
no, I don't remember this at all.
David Gilmour would come out and he's like exhibit A, so he puts it in front of David Gilmour, and David Gilmour's struggling to play another brick in the wall because he can't read. And they're like, what's the problem? He goes, well, they don't have the pictures where I put my fingers. And Lemmy comes out next, and I wanted to know if you knew what, like, he was playing. He came out to play one of his most famous bass riffs, and they go, okay, now you play. And Lemmy said, well, I can't, mate. There's no pictures. There's no pictures. And they bring out Mark Knopfler. They bring out all these people, and they can't read. They can't read their own music because Ken, does this ring a bell at all? It was I don't know if it was a TV show. It looked like it was the 90s. But it was hysterical. But I'm trying to remember. They said, they dipped into heavy metal, and then they brought Lemmy out, and he's playing. You would recognize the riff in a second, and I don't remember what it was. Not Top of the Pops. This was Top of the Pops this was like a comedy show.
Chris says French and Saunders TV show. I've never
That sounds
heard of that.
familiar. Right, it's him and his dad are in all the skits, right?
Okay.
I'll have to resend it to you. But,
okay, yeah, that sounds great. Let's talk a little bit other key criteria that I think we've brought up already, but we're heading towards having sort of a resolution. So, the Judas Priest, the Iron Maiden, the Motorhead, you notice there's been then this gravitation towards like the classic era of the band, with Painkiller being a little bit of an outlier on that. And I would say that these bands, when they're producing their best albums, they're like, their talent is really ripe. They've gone through the music industry BS and kind of come out on the other side. And they're all playing together properly. the band is not, falling apart or anything like that. Sometimes it could be growth on the part of the band. Adding Bruce Dickinson in on vocals, definitely changed Iron Maiden. So maybe one of the criteria, I'm not sure exactly what to call this in terms of, single words, but something like the band is all there. The band is firing on all cylinders. The band is in their most productive time, and some of these bands have had, that could be a whole decade. Some of these bands, it might be a narrower amount of time.
Yeah, but it is interesting that it's a classic ones. Although I almost thought I wouldn't have been shocked if Iron Maiden's Brave New World, their comeback album with Adrian Smith, did that make it anywhere? Because that was
there were a few people. Killers actually got more than that, and Killers is kind of an outlier as well. But yeah, there were a few people who singled that one out.
I mean, that was like, I remember when it came out, I had low expectations, but the fact that that was no filler to me. It was, and then the live, their show, they did the first 4 songs were from that album, and it was amazing. So it's not like Maiden wasn't still writing great records.
Yeah.
But I don't know. We do equate the early stuff, right? The classic,
it's almost like the band's ethos gets kind of established at that time, and then people will be like, this new stuff, it's not really like it, or, oh, it's another Motorhead album, but it's just another Motorhead album, and there'll be like a few songs off of, like, say, 1916 or Bastards that people will bring up, or Overnight Sensation, was another good one, but none of them have like the presence of Ace of Spades or and I would say that happened to Motorhead already by Rock and Roll, which is 1986, 1987. People were like, oh, it's good. It's Motorhead. It's a reliable quantity, right. But, we're really here to hear this other stuff.
That's the one, Andy. Sorry. Oh, Andy posted
Gary Moore. That would be funny as hell.
Yeah, everybody should watch that.
Okay.
It's one of, I died. Whoever thought of that. It's and the fact that they got all of these guitarists to show up to the show and make fun of themselves
and ham it up, right?
Yeah, well, they were making fun of themselves, and they were all great. And yeah, so the Lemmy one, you're gonna have to let me know. I forget, they announce it. They announce it like the song that they come out.
Yeah,
they play a bit of it and then they put the music now with the music, and they can't.
For younger people who are watching too, we should probably mention The Young Ones as a TV show, and the fact that Motorhead appeared not in their Ace of Spades lineup. By that time they were actually a 4-piece with Wurzel and Phil Campbell, but they played Ace of Spades on The Young Ones, and I think that's part of what established Ace of Spades as such a landmark song.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of people say if you get your song on a show, it'll take off. It doesn't matter how old it is.
We should actually do some research on this, because I'm sure there's a lot more shows out there. I remember when Anthrax came on Married with Children and played that really heavy song they've got. What is it? Is it My Life? In My Life? It was off a Persistence of Time album, and I was like, holy crap, this is like Motorhead playing on the Young Ones.
Yeah, and
I'm sure there's lots of examples out there of bands doing that,
and the songs will take off. I remember when we were kids, was the early 80s, that movie The Big Chill.
Yeah,
and it had all the music from the Motown era stuff. It was only 20 years old, but that's how everybody in school knew of the Temptations and everybody, because The Big Chill was.
I think Reservoir Dogs did that. There were a lot of people in the 90s who had the Reservoir Dogs soundtrack.
Yep.
Let's talk a bit more about polling. We have 2 more bands to hit on. So Dio is a little bit different, right? Because I didn't specify just Dio albums. In my polling, Holy Diver blew everything out of the water. Way more votes for Holy Diver than for anything else. But then people also said Rainbow Rising. So, with Richie Blackmore's Rainbow, Mob Rules with Black Sabbath, and then the two stragglers were Magica and Angry Machines.
Magica got some love. I like that.
Now, in Louder Sound, and this is really interesting, they picked Heaven and Hell, Black Sabbath, with Ronnie James Dio, Holy Diver second, and then the three Rainbow albums: Rainbow Rising, Rainbow, and Long Live Rock and Roll. So not a single other Dio album in the mix. So I don't know who Louder Sound is polling, but that's weird to me. Those Rainbow albums are great, right? But I mean, do you think that the Dio albums aren't better than the Rainbow albums, or
And that's funny because I remember when you put it up, us talking, wait a minute, we didn't make the distinction.
Right.
Just Dio. And it became fair game before we know it.
Yeah. And with somebody like Dio, I think it makes sense because he was established as a solo artist in part by being in Rainbow. He says this in his interviews. He learned a lot from Richie Blackmore and from Tony Iommi.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, and then he also brought his drummer from Black Sabbath, and he brought in some members too, like Jimmy Bain came to Dio, right, from Rainbow. So he poached people. He learned that from Richie Blackmore, I guess. Take other people's musicians away from them. So I think it is fair game.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy Bain for years. I mean, I have that Killing the Dragon live DVD. Jimmy Bain's right there.
Yeah.
Doug Aldrich on guitar, which is a great lineup. We could talk about the different Dio lineups with Craig Goldie versus Vivian.
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy Bain's sort of like a Bob Daisley, who yes. They moved in the same circles, right? Really great bassist, willing to, and I think there's something about being able to play in other people's bands and contribute that there's maybe something to be explored there. You listen to Jimmy Bain, you listen to Bob Daisley, you can recognize them in their bass lines as doing what they're doing. They never have a stable home like, say, Steve Harris did, or Ian Hill in Judas Priest. And so they're like, kind of like ultimate session players. And I haven't heard a bad song come out of either of them,
Well, it's apparent with Ozzy's rhythm section, including Randy Rhoads on the first couple albums.
Yeah.
With Tommy Eldridge. It's just, I always say you get all-star players and the band won't be good. I always joke about,
bands where you put together all the stars, it's tough to pull off a good one that'll last more than an album or two.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean they play well together. And Ken may agree with me, just because I use the football reference or soccer. Brazil has some of the greatest soccer players in the world, but they don't win games. So it's the same with the band. You've got Steve Harris, and then you've got some drummer, and they might not agree on the time, and it just doesn't gel.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said, like a band like U2 those records sound amazing. Are they great technical musicians? No, but they spent 8 hours a day playing together and they figured it out. It's how to sound like a band. So
a team of prima donnas does not necessarily a good band.
And I'm Italian. Ken, I'm sorry, my brother. My partner, she's from London, from North London. So we watched the game together last week and I had to sleep on the couch.
That's great.
My family's from Italy.
So Scott, what do you think is the best Dio album and why?
Okay, nobody's going to agree with me on the Sacred Heart.
Okay, why?
It's all amazing tunes. Those songs, King of Rock and Roll, the tune Sacred Heart's just really kind of haunting with that riff. Vivian's playing really melodic solos. I think he's got, Vivian played so great and unique. Besides Last in Line, which was probably my favorite solo he did, he just would hold on to a note and kind of, I know there was keyboards and stuff on it, but I think it's song-wise, it's my favorite album. And it's too bad Vivian didn't really do the tour after, because Goldie is a fine guitar player, but Vivian was just perfect for that era. And then I'd have to say, if I had to pick a second, I would go with Heaven and Hell.
Okay.
What a just amazing album. I mean,
some of the people who weighed in were talking about like the Rainbow or Sabbath era stuff and saying, well, you've got him with Tony Iommi, and Geezer Butler, and that adds in something that his own solo band couldn't provide. I would say it's different. I don't know that I would say that's better, but because Dio was able to put together some really killer bands,
And I think with Dio, once it became his name on the marquee, he wasn't going to half-ass anything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's why we don't really see a bad album from Dio, although he said he doesn't like what's the one after that? Craig Goldie's first album, Dream Evil.
Yeah.
But all the Full Sail Away.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Dream Evil's a great tune, but he somehow wasn't pleased with that album. Dio wasn't, but I thought it was maybe not his best, but there's some strong songs on that album.
Yeah.
And the performance is great.
Yeah.
So
I picked Last in Line. I really like Holy Diver. It was the first album that I had. And I think Last in Line is a better album.
It's a great record.
There's not a bad song. I mean, there's not a bad song on either of them. But some of the songs for me, like I Speed at Night, Egypt, Egypt gets me every time, Evil Eyes, and beginning with We Rock. Although, I mean, Holy Diver, beginning with Stand Up and Shout. I mean, Dio knew how to start an album.
Oh, yeah. And he goes with that sometimes. And wow. Those are great.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. What do the rest of you think? What's the best Dio album? And you can say Black Sabbath or Rainbow albums if you want to bring those in. I mean, let's actually say, well, while people are thinking about it, Scott, what would you say is the best Rainbow album that Dio's on?
The best Rainbow album. Well, see, again, we can't pick the live stuff because his performance on the live stuff is out of this world.
Yeah.
So I understand that, like Greg and I both say nobody can pick a greatest hits album. The reason we can't pick a greatest hits album is because it's taking stuff from different eras and different snapshots of time. Whereas a live album, you're taking one snapshot of a night or a few nights on that tour.
Yeah.
But you're using songs but Rainbow Rising.
I would say Rising too.
Yeah.
Oh, so Ken says Mob Rules. It's the finest doom metal album ever recorded. That's interesting.
That's cool.
Because you think of like older Sabbath as doom metal, but I guess Mob Rules, I guess it does fit in there. Yeah. Not Dio's best vocal performance, but as a whole album, it's timeless perfection. It is. I mean, both of the albums he did he also did Dehumanizer later on with Black Sabbath, but that's a later era. I mean, both of those two bridge albums between Rainbow and Dio are pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah. Well, just back to Dio's, watching the interviews. He doesn't sugarcoat anything.
No.
I just, I love it. We love him for that. The first question they ask in the interview is, what happened to Black Sabbath? Because remember, he joined us with Heaven and Hell.
Yeah.
Apparently, he didn't want to open on Ozfest for Ozzy.
Why would he? I mean, Ozzy was a complete jerk to him and had no reason to be.
And he said, and he goes, and I tell you, I knew it was going to happen. They just wanted him to come back in the band anyway. So, and I love how he doesn't go, well, we had some differences of opinion. He's just, and there's such an honesty to him. And I think live, there's that honesty where, when he did say when he does, don't talk to strangers. And then he says, "Why?" And he puts it in the mic to the audience, and we all scream. And he goes, "You get it right every time." And it's just kind of like, you don't, like you said earlier, you never feel like he's giving you a put on when you're in the audience. You feel like he's really connecting with the audience and like, thank you, okay, yeah, and he'll like point over. And I think he's one of the more sincere performers. Like, he took every show really seriously rather than. And I just feel that way with his albums. I'm saying too, it's kind of like just self pride, but also, you buy your ticket, you buy my album, I'm going to give you your money's worth. So that's that. I guess that, his personality and everything, just the whole deal package.
He was a catalyst in many respects. A catalyst is something that brings things out of a precipitate to allow out of a compound to allow them to precipitate out. So somebody who could bring potentiality to actuality, and to do so by coaching them, and by insisting on limits and things like that. I mean, we could actually do a whole episode on Dio sometime. That might be something to talk about. I would actually say that he more than anybody in the field of heavy metal, except for maybe Steve Harris, exemplifies what Aristotle calls the architectone, the maker who influences all the other makers and arranges things. So the word we get architect from. So, but we'll put that off. Let's talk about Accept before we have to sign off pretty soon. So Accept, the polling, people were kind of worn out, I think. We didn't get many results. And most people just said Restless and Wild. We did have one person who said Balls to the Wall fairly recently. So it's kind of interesting. Nobody said Metal Heart. Nobody said any of the more recent stuff, since Udo left way back, and they got like Mark Tornillo as a vocalist. So let's talk Accept. What would you say is their best album?
Me?
Yeah.
Metal Heart.
You're gonna say that.
I know it was gonna be like an unpopular one. It's funny because we go back to the marketing. I told you the story, Greg. So in 1985, when the album came out, there was a Tower Records right in Boston, and with every purchase, you got a 45 of the song Metal Heart, and the B-side was Screaming for a Love Bite.
Okay.
And I went home and I listened to it so much. I went back. I didn't have my license. I had my mom drive me, and I bought the album. And I got into them that way. Like, there's the first album, then you buy other albums. But
yeah,
the songs are really strong on there. They transferred great when, with Udo live. I mean, when they played it, it's just there's some of their really strong songwriting. I mean, Balls to the Wall is a great album. But yeah, Metal Heart, and I don't know. I'm surprised anybody else said that, because I'm thinking like, some people accuse me of like, there's the Tarulli albums that are like the outskirts, that are like the less popular ones. But I don't know. Did you think Metal Heart was a big one?
I would have expected to see more people say that they thought it was the best. I think that Restless and Wild, Balls to the Wall, Metal Heart, those three are probably, they should be the top three.
Okay.
I actually listened to Russian Roulette the other day, and that album does hold up. That's the last one they did with Udo, but nothing from it really gets into playlists. And then the earlier stuff, like I like Breaker, and I like I'm a Rebel. And I do like the stuff that Accept has done, since the split with Udo. We saw them on the Blind Rage tour.
Right.
A lot of stuff off of that, and Stalingrad are good. I want to say Balls to the Wall is the best album myself.
And it's hard because Love Child is such a great tune.
Well, it's full of great songs.
I know.
Mean, yeah. So Balls to the Wall, London Leather Boys, yeah. Fight It Back, Head Over Heels, which has been covered by a lot of other bands. Losing More Than You've Ever Had is a great song. That's just the first side. And then Love Child. Okay, if there's a weakest song on it, it's probably Turn Me On. But then losers and winners, I actually use that with Andy, when we're joking around and something goes wrong, I say, write a letter, you'll feel better. It's become sort of a trope. And then, Guardian of the Night and Winter Dreams, both a little bit more ballady, but still really, really heavy. And Restless and Wild is great, but I just don't think it's as good as Balls to the Wall myself, but I might be an outlier. What do the rest of you think? What's
Yeah,
the
I'm
best
curious.
Accept album?
Well, just Udo was the unexpected great front man. I mean,
Oh yeah.
he had everything that if you saw him on paper, if you read about him on paper, you'd be like, we don't want this guy, with the
Yeah.
camouflage pants and he, for lack of a better word, just kind of like you adore the guy. He just he with that voice, his rant voice, he had a normal voice, but he had that screaming voice all the time and the
Yeah.
accent, and it's just like, yeah. And we have to talk about how the rant fits into heavy metal, like Paul Stanley,
Yeah.
the stories, but in their character voice. And
Andy and I both saw Accept and Udo separately, obviously, within like a year of each other in New York. We saw Accept down at the Gramercy with Raven, and we saw Udo with his own band at the Chance in Poughkeepsie. And both were amazing shows. Although it was kind of interesting to see the tension between Wolf Hoffman, who seems to be kind of a jerk, and Herman Frank, who quit soon afterwards, along with the drummer. Now, Peter Baltes has left, Accept. So it's just basically whoever Wolf Hoffman hires around him and Mark Tornillo on lyrics. But Udo had all these younger guys. I mean, he was in his 60s when we saw him. He clearly loved what he was doing, and all these younger guys were like clearly into playing both the Udo stuff post Accept and the Accept standards. It was an amazing show. All right, so Ken says Balls is probably the better album from a musical and writing perspective, but Restless literally invented the European thrash scene, so it is unquestionable influence on so many subsequent bands. Yeah, I would say Balls to the Wall is more straight ahead classic metal, and it's not as fast. I think it's heavier, but it's not as fast as Restless and Wild. I almost called it Fast as a Shark. It's just one of the songs on it. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting about what Ken is saying. He's kind of using one of the criteria is it's an important album.
Yeah,
he feels
that's something we were talking about earlier, and specifically both thrash. So I mean, this is another thing we can explore. I want to do a session just on the early thrash metal, because when we were hearing this stuff, speed, thrash, were they different? Were they the same? It was really hard to tell sometimes. It really depended on who you were talking to, almost. And then thrash became its own thing, but super indebted to what we would call speed metal, which was never itself a really coherent genre. Like you could say Motorhead was speed metal. Is Iron Maiden speed metal? Yeah, kind of, but there were other bands where you'd be like, well, this is much more speed metal. Accept was at the the center of that as well. So
yeah, like we have to think about the times.
This is in.
Oh, yeah.
Ken says, I think Restless is the European Rain in Blood. Very interesting. I mean, because it would certainly antedate it, He's referring to Slayer's Rain in Blood. I mean, Slayer is actually, in some respects, a little bit of a latecomer compared to Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth. They definitely are positioning themselves. We're going to play faster than those guys. We're going to try to be heavier than those guys. Accept is predating all of them, as is Motorhead. So,
well, that's interesting because I think a lot of people credit Slayer as the innovators, or if they're more educated, it's kind of how they referred to Bach, that like Bach didn't invent Baroque music, but when he died, it ended because he mastered it.
Okay.
You know, and it's kind of like Slayer took these and then took it to the next level. I think if, you know, this is why it's important who you ask. If you ask somebody like Ken, who's aware of what happened before Slayer,
Yeah.
and, you know, Slayer, if you just say the word Slayer, oh, that's a thrash speed, whatever the band.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. You know, these other bands were doing it too, you know, but they just kind of took that all and, you know, like you said, you know, we're going to be faster. Well, faster, louder was the joke back then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're
gonna be so fast that nobody can actually, you know, hear
like,
us play.
Well, that was Napalm Death, right?
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, you reach a certain sort of, you know, point of diminishing return when you make those criteria the key thing. Oh, that's interesting. Ken says an argument could be made for Dissident Aggressor by Priest being the first speed metal track. Possibly so. Yeah, that's something I think we'd have to devote a lot more thought to. So this is a great segue for bringing this to a close. We went a little bit over our expected time, but some great conversation. Thanks to everybody who joined and contributed. Once again, thanks always to you, Scott, for showing up and contributing not just your enthusiasm, but your technical expertise.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I have a blast at these.
Yeah. So we will be doing thrash sometime down the line, but I'm not sure quite when. We haven't yet decided what the next topic is going to be, but I do think we'll probably do more polling down the line as well, with thinking about, like, you know, 1970s metal. What were the best albums? You know, maybe thrash, maybe some other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. Every time we do one of these, we go off into a subject that has to do with what we're talking about, but saying that's for
we open up a lot of cans of worms. Yeah.
Well, you know, that's the great thing about these discussions, because the fact that we're discussing and we have people with great perspective on things, it's something that I didn't think about, and that's the kind of the point of the discussion, is throw things in and go, you know what, we got to save this for another one. And really, I think a lot of these, you know, even this one came out of another one. Right. You know, kind of like, well, we can't talk about what the best is. That's a whole other thing. There's a whole other show, or, you know, of us, you know, what is the criteria? We can't talk about that right now. And so we got to talk about it today.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap up. Thanks to everybody. And, you know, keep listening to the heavy stuff.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.